California contains a wide range of environments, including extensive coastlines, fertile valleys, mountain systems, and arid interior regions. This environmental diversity created multiple zones of ecological opportunity for prehistoric humans over long periods of time. Rivers, wetlands, and coastal margins offered reliable resources, while uplands and deserts required flexible subsistence strategies. Archaeological evidence from the region is unevenly preserved and unevenly distributed, creating gaps in the record. As a result, interpretations rely on fragmented material remains, regional comparisons, and ongoing debate about the scale, timing, and organization of prehistoric human occupation. The physical setting of California is defined by strong contrasts in landform and ecology that developed over long geological timescales. The region includes an extended Pacific coastline, broad interior valleys, multiple mountain ranges, and expansive desert basins. These features are arranged in parallel bands that run generally north to south, creating distinct environmental zones within relatively short distances. For prehistoric humans, this configuration produced a landscape in which resources varied sharply by location, season, and elevation. Along the western edge of the region, the coastline is characterized by rocky headlands, sandy beaches, estuaries, and offshore islands. Ocean currents and seasonal upwelling created marine environments with high biological productivity. Coastal rivers discharged fresh water and sediment into the ocean, forming wetlands and lagoons that supported diverse plant and animal communities. These coastal settings offered predictable food sources, but were also subject to erosion, sea level change, and tectonic activity, all of which affect archaeological preservation. Inland from the coast lies a series of valleys, most prominently a large central lowland bounded by mountain systems. These valleys accumulated deep alluvial soils deposited by rivers and seasonal flooding. Grasslands, marshes, and riparian corridors developed in these areas, supporting large terrestrial mammals and a wide variety of plant species. Fresh water was generally abundant, though its distribution changed over time with climate fluctuations. Such valley environments provided opportunities for sustained human occupation, but also attracted repeated reuse over thousands of years, complicating the archaeological record. To the east of the valleys rise major mountain ranges formed by tectonic uplift and volcanic activity. Elevation gradients created sharp changes in temperature, precipitation, and vegetation over relatively short distances. Lower slopes supported oak woodlands and mixed forests, while higher elevations were dominated by conifer forests, alpine meadows, and seasonally snow-covered terrain. These upland zones were rich in specific resources but were accessible only during certain parts of the year. Movement between elevations required knowledge of terrain and seasonal cycles. Beyond the mountains, the eastern and southeastern portions of the region are dominated by arid basins and deserts. These areas receive limited rainfall and experience large temperature fluctuations. Vegetation is sparse and unevenly distributed, often concentrated around springs, intermittent streams, and ancient lakebeds. While deserts appear resource-poor at first glance, they contain localized concentrations of plants, animals, and raw materials that prehistoric humans could exploit with careful planning. Archaeological evidence suggests episodic use rather than continuous occupation in many desert zones. River systems played a central role in connecting these diverse landscapes. Major rivers flowed from the mountains into the valleys and toward the coast, transporting water, sediment, and nutrients. These rivers created linear corridors that facilitated movement, resource gathering, and long-term settlement. Seasonal flooding renewed soils and supported wetland habitats, while stable channels provided reliable access to fresh water. Changes in river courses over time have buried or destroyed many early archaeological deposits. Climate patterns across California were shaped by latitude, ocean influence, and topography. Coastal areas experienced relatively mild temperatures and moderated seasonal variation, while inland and high-elevation regions experienced more extreme conditions. Precipitation varied widely, with some areas receiving heavy winter rainfall and others remaining dry for extended periods. These climatic differences influenced plant communities and animal distributions, shaping the range of subsistence options available to prehistoric humans. The interaction between geography and climate produced a mosaic of ecological niches rather than a single uniform environment. Within this mosaic, resources were distributed unevenly, requiring flexible strategies for survival. Some zones offered year-round availability of food and water, while others required seasonal movement or storage practices. The proximity of multiple environments allowed groups to exploit different zones within manageable travel distances, encouraging regional mobility rather than long-distance migration. Geological processes also influenced human use of the landscape. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and gradual uplift altered landforms and drainage patterns. Coastal terraces were raised above sea level, while other areas subsided or eroded. Volcanic deposits created new surfaces for vegetation growth, but also buried earlier landscapes. These processes affect how archaeological materials are preserved and discovered, leading to uneven visibility of early human activity. Overall, California's geographic framework provided both opportunities and constraints for prehistoric humans. The close juxtaposition of coast, valley, mountain, and desert environments allowed access to a wide range of resources within a single region. At the same time, environmental variability required detailed local knowledge and adaptive responses. Archaeologists interpret this complex setting as a key factor shaping the long-term patterns of human occupation observed in the region. Environmental conditions in California during prehistoric periods were not static and changed repeatedly over long spans of time. These changes were driven by large-scale climatic systems, regional geography, and shifting oceanic patterns. Evidence from pollen records, lake sediments, glacial deposits, and faunal remains indicates that temperature, precipitation, and vegetation zones fluctuated substantially. These fluctuations shaped the availability of water, plants, and animals, and influenced where and how prehistoric humans could live. During colder phases associated with the late Pleistocene, temperatures were generally lower, and seasonal variation was more pronounced. Snowpack in mountain regions was more extensive, and glaciers were present at higher elevations. Meltwater from snow and ice contributed to larger and more stable river systems in some areas. Inland basins contained lakes that are no longer present today, creating wetlands and grasslands that supported large mammals. Coastal environments differed significantly due to lower sea levels, which exposed broader coastal plains and shifted shoreline locations. As global temperatures rose toward the end of the Pleistocene, environmental conditions gradually changed. Glaciers retreated, and many inland lakes shrank or disappeared. River systems adjusted to new flow regimes, and wetlands became more localized. Vegetation zones shifted upslope and northward as temperatures increased. These changes altered the distribution of plant and animal species, affecting the resource base available to prehistoric humans. Archaeologists suggest that such transitions required adjustments in settlement patterns and subsistence strategies. Precipitation patterns varied widely across the region and through time. Some periods were wetter, supporting expanded forests, grasslands, and marshes, while others were drier, leading to reduced water availability and more open landscapes. Coastal areas often retained relatively stable moisture due to marine influence, while interior valleys and deserts experienced greater variability. Extended dry periods would have reduced surface water and limited plant growth, increasing the importance of reliable water sources such as springs, rivers, and wetlands. Vegetation communities responded directly to these climatic shifts. Pollen evidence indicates that forests expanded during cooler and wetter periods and contracted during warmer or drier intervals. Oak woodlands, grasslands, chaparral, and desert scrub developed in varying proportions depending on local conditions. These plant communities provided different types of food resources, including seeds, nuts, roots, and fruits. Changes in vegetation would have influenced the seasonal availability of these resources and the labor required to collect and process them. Animal populations were similarly affected by environmental change. During earlier periods, large-bodied mammals were more widespread in some regions, supported by grasslands and wetlands. As climates warmed and habitats changed, many of these species declined or disappeared, while smaller mammals, birds, and reptiles became more prominent. Marine and freshwater species were influenced by changes in water temperature, salinity, and productivity. Archaeological faunal assemblages reflect these shifts and provide indirect evidence of changing environmental conditions. Fire was an important environmental factor, though its role is complex and debated. Natural fires, caused by lightning, occurred regularly in many ecosystems and influenced vegetation structure. Some researchers suggest that prehistoric humans may have used fire in limited ways to manage landscapes, but the extent and timing of such practices remain uncertain. Regardless of human involvement, fire contributed to the creation of patchy environments that supported diverse plant and animal communities. Sea level change had a particularly strong impact on coastal environments. Rising sea levels inundated earlier coastal plains, submerging sites that may have been occupied by prehistoric humans. This process has removed or buried evidence of early coastal settlement, contributing to gaps in the archaeological record. Shifting shorelines also altered estuaries, kelp forests, and intertidal zones, changing the availability of marine resources. These processes complicate efforts to reconstruct early coastal lifeways. Seasonality was a defining feature of environmental conditions across the region. Even in relatively mild coastal zones, resource availability varied throughout the year. Inland areas experienced more pronounced seasonal changes, with wet winters and dry summers. Mountain regions were accessible only during warmer months due to snow cover. Prehistoric humans would have needed to anticipate these seasonal cycles to ensure access to food and water, either through movement, storage, or a combination of strategies. Environmental variability also influenced the predictability of resources. Some environments offered stable and reliable food sources, while others were more uncertain. Wetlands and riparian zones tended to be productive, but could shift location over time. Desert environments offered concentrated resources in specific locations, but required detailed knowledge to exploit effectively. Archaeologists argue that long-term familiarity with local environments was essential for successful occupation. Overall, environmental conditions in prehistoric California were dynamic and regionally diverse. Climate fluctuations, shifting vegetation, changing animal populations, and evolving landscapes created both opportunities and constraints. The archaeological record reflects repeated human responses to these conditions, though many details remain uncertain due to preservation biases and incomplete data. Understanding these environmental factors provides a necessary context for interpreting patterns of prehistoric human adaptation in the region. Evidence from archaeology indicates that prehistoric human populations in California were diverse in both cultural practices and patterns of social organization. This diversity developed over long periods of time and was closely linked to the region's environmental variability. Rather than a single, uniform population, the archaeological record suggests the presence of multiple groups occupying different ecological zones, sometimes contemporaneously and sometimes sequentially. These groups adapted to local conditions while maintaining broader patterns that connect them to surrounding regions. Population size and density varied significantly across the landscape. Areas with reliable and abundant resources, such as coastal zones, river valleys, and wetlands, appear to have supported higher population densities. Inland deserts and high mountain regions generally show lower densities and more episodic use. Archaeologists estimate population levels indirectly through site counts, site size, midden accumulation, and the distribution of artifacts. These estimates remain approximate, as preservation and research coverage are uneven. Nevertheless, evidence indicates that population levels increased gradually over time in many regions, particularly during later prehistoric periods. Social organization among prehistoric humans in California is inferred primarily from settlement patterns and material remains rather than direct evidence. Early populations are generally understood to have lived in small, mobile bands composed of related individuals. These groups likely moved seasonally to exploit different resources, occupying temporary camps rather than permanent settlements. Over time, in some regions, evidence points to more stable residential patterns, including repeated use of specific locations and the development of semi-permanent or permanent villages. Settlement organization varied by region and resource base. Coastal and riverine areas often show evidence of long-term occupation at the same sites, indicated by deep midden deposits, diverse tool assemblages, and repeated construction of living surfaces. These sites suggest relatively stable communities with established territories. In contrast, upland and desert regions often contain smaller, more dispersed sites, consistent with seasonal movement and shorter-term occupation. The coexistence of these different settlement strategies reflects adaptation to local conditions rather than a single developmental sequence. Material culture provides further insight into cultural diversity. Stone tool assemblages vary across regions, with differences in raw material selection, tool types, and manufacturing techniques. These variations suggest regional traditions that were maintained over long periods. While some similarities indicate shared knowledge or interaction between groups, other differences point to localized practices and identities. Grinding implements, projectile points, and other tools show patterned variation that archaeologists use to distinguish cultural complexes. Exchange and interaction between groups are indicated by the movement of materials over considerable distances. Obsidian, shell, and other valued resources appear in regions far from their sources. This distribution suggests the existence of trade networks or down-the-line exchange systems linking different communities. Such networks would have facilitated not only the movement of materials, but also the transmission of ideas and technologies. The presence of non-local materials in many sites indicates that groups were not isolated, but connected through regional interaction. Population structure likely included kin-based social units, though direct evidence is limited. The organization of living spaces, the distribution of tools, and burial practices provide indirect clues. In some later sites, variation in burial treatment and grave goods suggests differences in social status or roles within communities. However, archaeologists debate the extent to which these differences reflect formal hierarchies versus situational distinctions such as age, skill, or lineage. Clear evidence for centralized political authority is generally absent in early periods. Demographic patterns were influenced by environmental stability and resource predictability. Regions with reliable food sources could support larger groups and more complex social arrangements. In such areas, population growth may have encouraged territoriality and more clearly defined group boundaries. In less predictable environments, smaller group sizes and flexible social arrangements would have reduced risk. Archaeological patterns suggest that both strategies were present within California at different times and places. Cultural continuity and change are both evident in the record. Some regions show long-term persistence of particular tool traditions and settlement patterns, suggesting stable cultural practices over thousands of years. Other areas show shifts that may reflect population movement, environmental change, or the adoption of new technologies. Distinguishing between these factors is challenging, as similar material changes can result from different processes. Archaeologists rely on comparative analysis and dating to assess whether changes represent gradual adaptation or more abrupt transitions. Language and belief systems cannot be reconstructed directly from prehistoric archaeological evidence. As a result, interpretations of cultural diversity focus on material remains rather than symbolic or ideological aspects. Archaeologists avoid assigning specific ethnic or linguistic identities to prehistoric groups unless supported by clear evidence. Instead, cultural variation is described in terms of observable patterns in tools, settlement, and subsistence. This approach reflects the limits of the data and the need for cautious interpretation. Mortuary practices offer limited but important information about social organization. In some regions, burials are simple and lack accompanying objects, suggesting relatively egalitarian social structures. In other cases, differences in burial location or associated items imply social differentiation. These patterns become more pronounced in later prehistoric periods, though their interpretation remains debated. The available evidence does not support uniform social structures across the region. Overall, the archaeological record indicates that prehistoric human populations in California were numerous, diverse, and adaptable. Cultural variation reflects long-term interaction between people and environment, as well as connections between neighboring regions. Population growth, social organization, and material traditions developed unevenly across the landscape. Archaeologists emphasize that this diversity is a defining characteristic of prehistoric California and must be considered when interpreting evidence of human occupation and adaptation. The earliest evidence for human presence in California remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. Archaeologists agree that humans occupied the region by the late Pleistocene, but the timing, routes of entry, and scale of early settlement are not firmly established. The archaeological record for these early periods is sparse, fragmented, and unevenly preserved, making interpretation difficult. As a result, conclusions are based on limited material evidence, indirect indicators, and comparisons with better documented regions. Much of the uncertainty surrounding early human presence relates to broader questions about the initial peopling of the Americas. Some researchers argue for an early arrival of humans prior to the widespread appearance of Clovis-style technology, while others maintain that the evidence for such early occupation is inconclusive. In California, claims of very early sites are closely scrutinized because natural processes can produce features that resemble human-made tools or activity. Distinguishing between cultural artifacts and geofacts is a central challenge in evaluating early sites. Several locations in California have been proposed as evidence for early human activity. These sites often consist of isolated stone objects, modified bones, or disturbed sediments. In many cases, the contexts in which these materials were found complicate interpretation. Erosion, redeposition, and tectonic activity can displace objects from their original positions. Without clear associations between artifacts, features, and datable materials, it is difficult to demonstrate intentional human activity with confidence. One area of debate concerns the presence or absence of Clovis culture in California. Clovis technology, characterized by distinctive fluted projectile points, is well documented in many parts of North America. In California, however, classic Clovis points are relatively rare. Some researchers argue that this scarcity indicates that early populations in the region followed technological traditions different from those found elsewhere. Others suggest that Clovis sites may exist but remain undiscovered due to preservation issues or limited survey coverage. The limited visibility of early sites is partly explained by environmental change. During the late Pleistocene, sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. Large portions of the ancient coastline are now submerged, along with any archaeological sites that may have been located there. This has led researchers to suggest that early human groups may have relied heavily on coastal resources, leaving behind evidence that is now inaccessible beneath the ocean. Inland sites from the same period may also have been affected by erosion, sedimentation, or later human activity. Preservation bias further complicates the picture. Organic materials such as wood, plant fibers, and animal remains are less likely to survive over long periods, particularly in open-air sites. As a result, early occupations may be underrepresented in the archaeological record. Stone tools are more durable, but even these can be difficult to identify without clear patterns of manufacture or use. Small sample sizes increase the risk of misinterpretation. Radiocarbon dating provides a critical tool for assessing early human presence, but it is not always available or reliable in early contexts. Many proposed early sites lack suitable materials for dating, such as charcoal or bone with preserved collagen. In some cases, dates are obtained from surrounding sediments rather than directly from artifacts, which introduces uncertainty. Researchers debate how closely such dates can be linked to human activity. Despite these challenges, evidence indicates that humans were established in California by the end of the Pleistocene. Sites dating to this general period show increasing clarity in artifact assemblages, settlement patterns, and subsistence indicators. These later sites provide a more secure foundation for understanding early occupation, even if the earliest phases remain poorly defined. The gradual accumulation of evidence suggests a process of exploration, adaptation, and population growth rather than a single, rapid expansion. The geographic distribution of early sites also informs interpretations of settlement routes. Some researchers propose that early populations entered the region from the north and moved southward along interior corridors, following river systems and open habitats. Others emphasize the potential importance of coastal movement, facilitated by marine resources and relatively stable environments. The relative contribution of these routes remains debated, in part because the archaeological signatures of coastal travel are difficult to detect. Inland regions provide somewhat clearer evidence of early human presence, though still limited. Sites in valleys and foothills often preserve stone tools and faunal remains in stratified contexts. These materials indicate hunting and processing of animals, as well as the use of local raw materials for tool production. Even so, the number of securely dated early sites is small, and their spatial distribution is uneven. The relationship between early humans and Pleistocene fauna is another area of discussion. In some regions of North America, associations between human artifacts and extinct large mammals have been documented. In California, such associations are rare and contested. While remains of large mammals are present in Pleistocene deposits, clear evidence of systematic hunting by humans is limited. Archaeologists caution against assuming direct interaction without strong contextual support. Researchers also consider the possibility that early populations were small and highly mobile. Such groups would leave fewer archaeological traces than larger, more sedentary communities. Short-term camps, light toolkits, and minimal modification of the landscape would be difficult to detect after thousands of years. This interpretation aligns with models that emphasize low population densities and flexible movement during initial settlement phases. Overall, the earliest human presence in California remains only partially understood. Archaeological evidence supports occupation by the late Pleistocene, but earlier phases are debated and incompletely documented. Ongoing research, including underwater archaeology, improved dating methods, and expanded survey coverage, continues to refine interpretations. For now, archaeologists emphasize caution, acknowledging both the limits of the current evidence and the likelihood that future discoveries may alter existing models of early settlement. Archaeological evidence for prehistoric humans in California is derived from a wide range of sites that vary in age, location, and degree of preservation. These sites include open-air camps, rock shelters, shell middens, quarry locations, and burial areas. Together, they provide the primary material basis for reconstructing patterns of occupation, technology, and subsistence. The distribution of sites is uneven, reflecting both past human behavior and modern research focus. Some of the most informative archaeological sites are located along the coast, where long-term occupation produced substantial accumulations of material remains. Coastal shell middens are particularly prominent. These deposits consist of discarded shells, animal bones, tools, and other refuse accumulated over repeated use of a location. The depth and extent of some middens indicate occupation spanning many centuries. They provide evidence for marine resource use, site permanence, and changes in subsistence practices over time. Inland sites are often more dispersed and variable in form. Valley and foothill locations frequently contain remains of camps associated with hunting and gathering activities. These sites may include hearths, stone tools, and faunal remains. In many cases, they represent repeated short-term use rather than continuous occupation. Stratified deposits in these areas allow archaeologists to track changes in tool types and resource use across time, though such sites are less common than surface scatters. Rock shelters and caves offer some of the best preserved archaeological contexts. Their protected environments reduce the effects of erosion and weathering, allowing organic materials to survive under favorable conditions. Evidence from these sites includes stone tools, plant remains, animal bones, and sometimes human burials. The presence of intact stratigraphy enables more reliable dating and interpretation. However, rock shelters represent only a portion of prehistoric activity and may reflect specific uses rather than general settlement patterns. Several well-documented sites have contributed significantly to understanding prehistoric occupation in California. Sites along the southern and central coast have yielded early evidence of marine resource exploitation, including fish bones, shellfish remains, and fishing implements. Inland sites in valleys and near water sources provide evidence of terrestrial hunting and plant processing. Obsidian sourcing studies link many of these sites to distant raw material sources, indicating movement or exchange across large areas. The types of artifacts recovered from these sites vary by region and period. Stone tools are the most common and durable remains. These include projectile points, bifaces, scrapers, drills, and flakes produced during tool manufacture. Variations in tool form and manufacturing technique are used to identify regional traditions and chronological sequences. Grinding tools, such as mortars and pestles, are also widespread and indicate intensive processing of plant foods. Faunal remains provide direct evidence of subsistence practices, but are subject to preservation biases. Bone survives best in sheltered or alkaline environments and is often absent from open-air sites. Where preserved, faunal assemblages include remains of mammals, birds, fish, and shellfish. Cut marks, burning, and breakage patterns are used to infer human processing. Interpreting these assemblages requires careful analysis to distinguish human activity from natural accumulation. Plant remains are more difficult to recover and interpret. Charred seeds, nutshells, and other botanical materials are sometimes preserved in hearths or midden deposits. These remains indicate the use of seeds, nuts, and other plant foods. Grinding implements provide indirect evidence for plant processing even when botanical remains are absent. Advances in flotation and residue analysis have improved recovery of plant remains, but coverage remains uneven across the region. Human burials are relatively rare in the early archaeological record, but become more common in later periods. Burial contexts provide information about health, diet, and social differentiation. Skeletal analysis can reveal patterns of trauma, disease, and nutritional stress. Associated grave goods, when present, offer clues about social roles and status. Interpretation of burials is approached cautiously, as practices vary widely and may not reflect everyday life. Dating archaeological sites relies primarily on radiocarbon methods, supplemented by stratigraphic relationships and artifact typology. Radiocarbon dates are obtained from charcoal, bone, shell, and other organic materials. Calibration of dates accounts for fluctuations in atmospheric carbon levels. In coastal contexts, marine reservoir effects complicate dating of shell and marine organisms, requiring correction factors. As a result, chronological frameworks are continually refined as new data become available. The spatial distribution of sites reflects both ancient settlement choices and modern research patterns. Areas near modern development have often been surveyed more intensively due to compliance-driven archaeology, leading to a concentration of documented sites. Remote regions remain less studied, and many sites have likely been destroyed or buried. Coastal erosion, river migration, and urban expansion have removed or altered large portions of the archaeological record. Interpretation of archaeological evidence requires integration of multiple lines of data. Single artifacts or isolated finds are rarely sufficient to establish patterns of behavior. Instead, archaeologists compare assemblages across sites and regions to identify recurring associations. This comparative approach helps distinguish local variation from broader trends. It also allows researchers to assess continuity and change over long periods. Preservation issues are central to evaluating the archaeological record. Coastal sites are threatened by rising sea levels and erosion, while inland sites may be buried by sediment or disturbed by later activity. Organic materials are unevenly preserved, limiting reconstructions of diet and technology. These biases mean that absence of evidence cannot be equated with absence of activity. Archaeologists emphasize that the current record represents only a fraction of past human behavior. Despite these limitations, the accumulated archaeological evidence provides a substantial foundation for understanding prehistoric humans in California. The diversity of site types and materials reflects long-term occupation and adaptation to varied environments. Ongoing research continues to identify new sites, refine dating, and improve analytical methods. As a result, interpretations of prehistoric life in the region remain subject to revision, grounded in material evidence and cautious analysis rather than speculation. Subsistence practices among prehistoric humans in California were shaped by the region's environmental diversity and by long-term changes in climate and resource availability. Archaeological evidence indicates that food acquisition relied on a broad spectrum of strategies rather than a narrow dependence on a single resource. Hunting, gathering, fishing, and the collection of shellfish were combined in different proportions depending on location, season, and period. This flexibility is considered a defining feature of prehistoric subsistence systems in the region. Terrestrial hunting formed one component of subsistence, though its relative importance varied. Faunal remains from inland sites indicate the exploitation of medium and small-sized mammals, including deer, rabbits, and rodents. Larger mammals appear less frequently in later contexts, reflecting both environmental change and shifts in hunting focus. Projectile points, bifaces, and butchering tools provide indirect evidence for hunting practices. Cut marks and burning on bones support interpretations of human processing, though such evidence is unevenly preserved. Gathering of plant foods played a central role across most regions. Archaeologists suggest that seeds, nuts, roots, and fruits contributed a substantial portion of caloric intake. Oak acorns are frequently cited as an important staple in many areas, based on the widespread presence of grinding tools such as mortars and pestles. Processing acorns requires repeated steps, including leaching and grinding, indicating a significant investment of labor. The prevalence of these tools suggests long-term reliance on plant resources that could be stored and processed as needed. Seed processing is indicated by the presence of manos and metates in many inland and foothill sites. These tools were used to grind small seeds into meal, increasing their digestibility and nutritional value. Archaeological assemblages show that grinding technology became more common over time, suggesting intensification of plant use. This shift may reflect population growth, increased sedentism, or changes in resource availability. Direct botanical evidence, when preserved, supports the use of a wide range of plant species rather than a narrow set of crops. Coastal subsistence strategies differed in emphasis from inland systems. Shellfish collection is well documented through extensive shell midden deposits. Species composition varies by location and reflects local intertidal conditions. Fish remains indicate the use of nearshore and estuarine species, while occasional remains of marine mammals suggest opportunistic exploitation rather than systematic hunting. Fishing technologies likely included nets, hooks, and traps, though organic components rarely survive archaeologically. Marine resources offered relatively predictable returns compared to some terrestrial foods. This predictability may have supported more stable settlement patterns along the coast. The accumulation of large midden deposits indicates repeated use of the same locations over long periods. However, coastal subsistence also required detailed knowledge of tides, seasons, and species behavior. Archaeologists note that coastal economies were not exclusively marine, but incorporated terrestrial plants and animals as well. Freshwater resources contributed to subsistence in riverine and wetland environments. Fish, waterfowl, and aquatic plants appear in archaeological assemblages from valley and delta regions. These environments were highly productive, but also subject to seasonal flooding and shifting channels. Evidence indicates that prehistoric humans adjusted their use of these areas in response to changes in water availability. Temporary camps near rivers suggest seasonal exploitation rather than permanent residence in some cases. Food processing and storage were important aspects of subsistence systems. The presence of large grinding features, storage pits, and hearths indicates preparation beyond immediate consumption. Storage of dried seeds, nuts, and other foods would have reduced risk during periods of scarcity. Archaeologists debate the extent to which storage contributed to social differentiation, but agree that it played a role in supporting larger and more stable populations in some regions. Labor organization related to subsistence can be inferred indirectly. The processing of certain foods, such as acorns and small seeds, requires sustained effort and coordination. Tool assemblages suggest that multiple individuals were involved in food preparation activities. Seasonal scheduling of subsistence tasks would have structured movement and settlement patterns. While the archaeological record does not preserve direct evidence of labor roles, material remains indicate planned and repetitive activities. Exchange networks influenced subsistence by facilitating access to resources not locally available. Shell beads, obsidian, and other materials appear far from their sources. While these items are often discussed in social or symbolic contexts, exchange also had practical implications. Movement of food resources themselves is more difficult to document, but indirect evidence suggests that some foods may have been transported or exchanged between groups, particularly in later periods. Subsistence strategies changed over time in response to environmental and demographic factors. As climates shifted and populations increased, evidence points to greater reliance on intensive plant processing and diversified resource use. Hunting appears to have become more focused on smaller, more abundant species. Marine exploitation shows increased specialization in some coastal areas. These changes are interpreted as adaptive responses rather than signs of decline or stress. Archaeologists emphasize that subsistence systems were regionally variable and cannot be generalized across the entire area. Coastal, valley, mountain, and desert environments each supported different combinations of food resources. Groups occupying these zones developed strategies suited to local conditions, often incorporating seasonal movement to access multiple resource areas. This regional differentiation complicates broad models but provides insight into adaptive flexibility. The archaeological record also reflects constraints on interpretation. Preservation biases affect the visibility of certain foods and activities. Plant remains are underrepresented relative to animal bones and stone tools. Coastal sites are threatened by erosion and sea level change, while inland sites may lack organic preservation. As a result, reconstructions of diet rely on multiple lines of indirect evidence. Overall, subsistence among prehistoric humans in California was characterized by diversity, flexibility, and long-term adjustment to changing conditions. Evidence indicates a broad-spectrum economy that integrated hunting, gathering, fishing, and shellfish collection. These practices supported human occupation across a wide range of environments and formed the material foundation for later developments in technology, settlement, and social organization. Technological systems used by prehistoric humans in California are known primarily through durable material remains, especially stone tools and ground stone implements. These technologies developed gradually over long periods and show both continuity and regional variation. Archaeologists interpret technological change as closely tied to subsistence strategies, raw material availability, and patterns of mobility rather than as rapid innovation or replacement. Stone tool technology forms the most visible component of the archaeological record. Early assemblages are dominated by simple flaked stone tools produced from locally available materials such as chert, basalt, and obsidian. These tools include flakes, cores, bifaces, and scrapers. Manufacturing techniques emphasize direct percussion with later refinement through pressure. Flaking in some contexts. Variation in tool form reflects differences in function, raw material constraints, and regional traditions. Projectile point traditions are often used to establish relative chronologies and regional patterns. In California, projectile points vary widely in size, shape, and manufacturing technique. Some are associated with spear or dart technology, while smaller points may indicate the use of the bow and arrow in later periods. Archaeologists rely on stratigraphic context and radiocarbon associations to place these tools within broader temporal frameworks. However, overlapping forms and long periods of use complicate precise dating. Obsidian played a particularly important role in stone tool production where it was available. Obsidian sources are geographically limited, but obsidian artifacts are found across wide areas. Geochemical sourcing allows researchers to trace obsidian artifacts back to specific volcanic origins. These studies indicate that prehistoric humans transported obsidian over long distances or acquired it through exchange networks. Obsidian tools were valued for their sharpness and predictability in flaking, but were also relatively fragile. Groundstone technology represents another major technological tradition. Grinding implements such as manos, metates, mortars, and pestles are widespread across much of California. These tools are associated with the processing of seeds, nuts, and other plant foods. The size and permanence of some grinding features suggest repeated use over long periods. Bedrock mortars, in particular, indicate sustained occupation or regular seasonal return to specific locations. The development and increased frequency of groundstone tools over time are often interpreted as evidence for intensified plant use. Grinding technology requires significant investment in tool production and maintenance. Its prevalence suggests that plant foods formed a reliable and important component of the diet. Archaeologists debate whether this shift reflects population growth, environmental change, or cultural preference, but agree that grinding technology was central to later prehistoric economies. Toolkits also included implements for cutting, scraping, drilling, and shaping materials such as wood, bone, and hide. Although organic tools rarely survive, stone tools used in their manufacture are common. Use-wear analysis provides insight into how these tools were employed. Microscopic examination of tool edges reveals patterns of wear consistent with cutting plants, processing hides, or working wood. These analyses support interpretations of diversified technological activities beyond hunting. Fishing and maritime technologies are less visible archaeologically due to poor preservation of organic materials. Nevertheless, indirect evidence suggests the use of nets, hooks, and traps in coastal and riverine environments. Bone and shell fishhooks have been recovered from some sites, indicating specialized fishing practices. Stone weights and notched pebbles are interpreted as net sinkers. These technologies imply knowledge of aquatic environments and species behavior. Watercraft technology is inferred primarily from settlement patterns and resource exploitation rather than direct evidence. The presence of offshore island sites and the transport of marine resources inland suggest the use of boats or rafts. Wooden watercraft do not preserve well archaeologically, leaving their construction and form largely unknown. Researchers infer their existence based on the distribution of sites and materials rather than physical remains. Weapons technology reflects both subsistence and social factors. Projectile points and associated tools indicate hunting strategies adapted to different prey and environments. Changes in point size and form are sometimes linked to shifts from spear thrower systems to bow and arrow technology. Archaeologists debate the timing and spread of these changes, as direct associations are rare. The introduction of smaller projectile points is generally placed in later prehistoric periods, though regional variation is significant. Technological organization varied with mobility patterns. Highly mobile groups tended to carry lighter, more versatile toolkits, emphasizing expedient tools made from local materials. More sedentary groups invested in heavier, durable tools and features, such as large grinding surfaces. Archaeologists interpret these differences as adaptive responses to settlement stability and resource predictability rather than as indicators of technological advancement. Repair and reuse of tools are evident in many assemblages. Broken tools were often resharpened or repurposed, extending their use life. This practice reflects both the value of raw materials and the effort required to acquire them. Obsidian artifacts, in particular, show extensive resharpening. Such patterns suggest planned tool use and maintenance rather than disposable production. Technological change over time appears gradual rather than abrupt. Many tool types persist for long periods with minor modifications. When new technologies appear, they often coexist with older forms rather than replacing them entirely. This continuity suggests cumulative adaptation rather than rapid transformation. Archaeologists caution against interpreting technological variation as linear progress, emphasizing instead the role of local conditions and choices. Regional differentiation in technology is evident across California. Coastal assemblages emphasize tools related to fishing and shellfish processing, while inland assemblages contain more hunting and plant processing implements. Mountain and desert regions show specialized toolkits adapted to seasonal use and resource scarcity. These patterns highlight the close relationship between technology and environment. Limitations of the archaeological record shape interpretations of technology. Organic components such as wooden shafts, nets, baskets, and clothing are largely absent. As a result, reconstructed technological systems are incomplete. Archaeologists rely on indirect evidence and comparative studies to fill these gaps, acknowledging uncertainty where direct evidence is lacking. Overall, technological systems used by prehistoric humans in California reflect long-term adaptation to diverse environments and subsistence strategies. Stone and groundstone tools dominate the material record, but they represent only part of a broader technological repertoire. Evidence indicates careful selection of materials, planned production, and sustained use, rather than simple or opportunistic technology. These systems provided the material foundation for changes in settlement, subsistence, and social organization observed in later prehistoric periods. Climatic transitions played a central role in shaping prehistoric human occupation in California by altering ecosystems, resource availability, and the structure of landscapes. These transitions occurred gradually over long periods, but produced significant cumulative effects. Archaeological interpretation relies on environmental proxies such as pollen cores, lake sediments, glacial records, and faunal assemblages to reconstruct these changes. While the broad outlines of climatic shifts are well established, their local impacts and timing vary by region and remain subjects of ongoing research. During the late Pleistocene, climatic conditions were generally cooler than those of later periods. Mountain glaciers were present at higher elevations, and snowpack persisted longer into the year. These conditions contributed to sustained river flow and the formation of large lakes in interior basins. Wetlands and grasslands were more extensive in some regions, supporting animal communities that differed from those of later periods. For prehistoric humans, These environments offered certain resources that later declined or disappeared. As the climate warmed toward the end of the Pleistocene, glacial retreat altered hydrological systems. Rivers adjusted to changing flow regimes, and many interior lakes began to shrink or dry out. Wetland areas contracted, and grasslands were replaced in some regions by shrubland or woodland. These changes affected the distribution of animals and plants, reducing the availability of some resources while increasing others. Archaeological evidence suggests that human settlement patterns shifted in response, with some areas seeing reduced use and others becoming more favorable. The transition into the Holocene is marked by increasing temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. In California, this transition did not produce uniform conditions across the region. Coastal areas experienced relatively moderate changes due to the influence of the Pacific Ocean, while interior valleys and deserts experienced greater variability. Some periods were characterized by increased moisture, while others were marked by prolonged dryness. These fluctuations influenced where surface water was available and how predictable resources were from year to year. Vegetation zones responded to these climatic changes by shifting in elevation and distribution. Forests expanded into higher elevations as temperatures increased, while lower elevations saw the development of oak woodlands, grasslands, and chaparral. In arid regions, desert vegetation became more established as lakes receded. These changes affected the availability of plant foods used by prehistoric humans, such as seeds, nuts, and roots. Archaeologists interpret increases in grinding tools during certain periods as evidence of greater reliance on plant resources adapted to drier conditions. Faunal communities also changed in response to climate transitions. Large mammals that depended on grassland and wetland habitats declined or became locally extinct as these environments contracted. Smaller mammals, birds, and reptiles became more prominent in archaeological assemblages. Marine species distributions were affected by changes in ocean temperature and productivity. Evidence from coastal sites indicates shifts in the species composition of shellfish and fish remains over time, reflecting environmental change rather than abrupt shifts in human behavior. Sea level rise during the Holocene had significant consequences for coastal landscapes. As ice sheets melted, global sea levels increased, submerging earlier coastal plains. In California, this process reshaped shorelines and estuaries, creating new habitats while inundating others. Archaeological sites that were once located near ancient shorelines are now underwater or buried beneath coastal sediments. This has created a preservation bias that limits understanding of early coastal occupation and resource use. Changes in climate also influenced seasonality. In many regions, seasonal contrasts became more pronounced, with wet winters and dry summers. These patterns structured the timing of plant growth, animal movement, and water availability. Prehistoric humans would have needed to adjust their schedules to align with these cycles. Archaeological evidence of seasonal site use, such as short-term camps and storage features, is interpreted as a response to predictable seasonal variation rather than to sudden environmental stress. Periods of increased aridity are documented in multiple environmental records. During these intervals, surface water sources became less reliable, and plant productivity declined in some areas. Archaeologists note changes in settlement distribution during such periods, including increased use of coastal zones and areas with permanent water sources. In interior regions, evidence suggests greater mobility or reduced occupation. These patterns are interpreted as adaptive responses to changing conditions rather than population collapse. Conversely, wetter periods supported expanded use of inland valleys and foothills. Increased precipitation enhanced plant growth and supported higher densities of animals. Archaeological sites from these periods often show greater artifact density and evidence of repeated occupation. Such conditions may have facilitated population growth and the development of more stable settlement patterns. However, archaeologists emphasize that these relationships are complex and influenced by multiple factors. Climatic variability also affected fire regimes. Changes in temperature and moisture influenced vegetation density and fuel availability, altering the frequency and intensity of natural fires. These fires reshaped landscapes by creating mosaics of vegetation at different stages of growth. While the role of human-set fires is debated, natural fire patterns alone would have influenced resource distribution. Archaeological interpretations consider fire as an environmental process rather than solely as a human intervention. Long-term climatic trends interacted with shorter-term fluctuations. Droughts lasting decades or longer are documented in some records, while other intervals show relatively stable conditions. These shorter-term events could have had localized impacts on water availability and food resources. Archaeologists caution that such events are difficult to correlate directly with specific archaeological sites due to dating resolution and preservation issues. Nonetheless, they are considered an important factor in understanding regional variability. The impact of climate transitions was not uniform across California. Coastal zones, interior valleys, mountains, and deserts each responded differently to the same broad climatic shifts. As a result, human groups occupying these regions experience distinct challenges and opportunities. Archaeological evidence reflects this variability in settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and technological emphasis. There is no indication of a single regional response to climate change. Archaeologists generally interpret climatic transitions as drivers of gradual adjustment rather than abrupt transformation. Evidence points to continuity in occupation in many areas, with changes in resource use and settlement intensity rather than abandonment. Where occupation declined, it is often difficult to determine whether climate, population movement, or research bias is responsible. Caution is therefore emphasized in linking environmental change directly to human behavior. Overall, climate transitions formed a dynamic background against which prehistoric human adaptation unfolded. Shifts in temperature, precipitation, sea level, and vegetation altered the structure of landscapes and resource distributions. Archaeological evidence indicates that prehistoric humans responded through changes in mobility, subsistence emphasis, and settlement location. These responses were regionally specific and developed over extended periods, reflecting long-term interaction between people and changing environments rather than sudden or uniform change. Regional differentiation in prehistoric California developed through long-term interaction between human groups and distinct environmental zones. Archaeological evidence indicates that patterns of settlement, subsistence, and technology varied systematically across coastal, valley, mountain, and desert regions. These differences did not emerge suddenly, but accumulated over extended periods as populations adjusted to local conditions. Researchers emphasize that regional variation reflects adaptation rather than isolation, as groups remained connected through movement and exchange. Coastal regions supported settlement patterns distinct from those of inland areas. Access to marine resources provided relatively stable food supplies throughout much of the year. As a result, archaeological sites along the coast often show evidence of repeated occupation and long-term use. Deep midden deposits, dense artifact concentrations, and substantial features suggest that some coastal locations functioned as central residential areas rather than short-term camps. These patterns contrast with those observed in many inland environments. In interior valleys, prehistoric humans exploited a combination of terrestrial animals, plant foods, and freshwater resources. These areas offered fertile soils and diverse ecosystems, but were subject to seasonal flooding and variability in water availability. Archaeological sites in valley settings often reflect seasonal scheduling, with evidence for repeated visits tied to specific resource cycles. Settlement patterns indicate a balance between mobility and stability, with some locations used regularly but not necessarily occupied year-round. Mountain regions presented different constraints and opportunities. High elevations offered access to specific resources, such as certain plant species and game animals, but were limited by cold temperatures and seasonal snow cover. Archaeological evidence from upland areas often consists of small, specialized sites interpreted as seasonal camps. These sites suggest that mountain regions were integrated into broader settlement systems rather than occupied independently. Movement between elevations appears to have been a key adaptive strategy. Desert regions required particularly flexible responses due to limited and unevenly distributed resources. Water sources were often scarce and localized, concentrating human activity around springs, intermittent streams, and ancient lakebeds. Archaeological sites in these areas are generally sparse and widely distributed, indicating episodic use rather than continuous occupation. Evidence suggests that prehistoric humans had detailed knowledge of desert landscapes and resource timing, allowing them to exploit these environments despite apparent constraints. Differences between regions are also evident in material culture. Stone tool assemblages vary in composition and emphasis, reflecting local subsistence needs and raw material availability. Coastal assemblages tend to include tools associated with fishing and shellfish processing, while inland assemblages emphasize hunting and plant processing implements. Groundstone tools are particularly abundant in regions where seed and nut processing was important. These patterns are interpreted as functional responses rather than markers of rigid cultural boundaries. Settlement mobility varied regionally and changed over time. In resource-rich areas, evidence points to reduced mobility and increased investment in fixed locations. In less predictable environments, higher mobility appears to have reduced risk by allowing groups to move between resource patches. Archaeologists note that mobility should not be understood as uniform movement across large territories, but as structured seasonal patterns tied to known resource locations. Regional differentiation thus reflects variation in how mobility was organized rather than its simple presence or absence. Regional traditions can be identified through recurring patterns in artifact styles and site organization. These traditions persist over long periods, suggesting cultural continuity within regions. However, boundaries between traditions are rarely sharp. Instead, archaeological evidence often shows gradual transitions, with shared elements appearing across adjacent regions. This pattern supports interpretations of interaction and exchange rather than strict separation. Changes in settlement organization over time also contributed to regional differentiation. In some areas, evidence indicates a shift from short-term camps to more permanent residential sites. This shift is often associated with intensified use of specific resources and the development of storage practices. In other regions, settlement patterns remained more mobile, reflecting continued reliance on dispersed or seasonal resources. These divergent trajectories occurred simultaneously in different parts of the region. Environmental change interacted with regional differentiation by altering resource distributions unevenly. Climatic shifts affected coastal productivity, river flow, and desert water availability in different ways. As a result, regions responded differently to the same broad environmental trends. Archaeological evidence suggests that some areas experienced increased occupation, while others saw reduced use during particular periods. These changes reinforced existing regional patterns rather than eliminating them. Exchange networks played an important role in linking regions. The movement of raw materials, such as obsidian and shell, demonstrates connections between coastal and inland groups. These networks allowed access to resources not locally available and facilitated the spread of technological practices. Exchange did not eliminate regional differences, but operated within them, maintaining diversity while enabling interaction. Regional differentiation is also evident in patterns of site reuse. Some locations were occupied repeatedly over thousands of years, indicating long-term attachment to particular places. Other areas show more ephemeral use with limited evidence for sustained occupation. These differences reflect both environmental potential and cultural choice. Archaeologists emphasize that regional patterns result from cumulative decisions made by generations of inhabitants. Importantly, regional differentiation does not imply that prehistoric California was divided into fixed or isolated territories. Instead, evidence points to overlapping use areas, shared resource zones, and flexible boundaries. Seasonal movement and exchange would have brought groups into contact, allowing for the transmission of knowledge and materials. Regional identities, as inferred from material culture, likely developed within this context of interaction rather than separation. Interpretation of regional variation is constrained by uneven research coverage. Some regions have been studied intensively, while others remain poorly documented. Differences in site visibility and preservation further complicate comparison. Archaeologists caution that apparent absences may reflect limited data rather than true lack of activity. As research expands, existing models of regional differentiation may require revision. Overall, regional differentiation in prehistoric California reflects long-term adaptation to diverse environments. Variations in settlement, subsistence, technology, and mobility developed gradually and persisted alongside ongoing interaction. These patterns demonstrate that prehistoric humans organized their lives in ways closely tied to local conditions while remaining part of broader regional systems. Evidence for social complexity among prehistoric humans in California is derived from material remains rather than written records. Archaeologists infer aspects of social organization from settlement patterns, burial practices, distribution of artifacts, and indicators of conflict or cooperation. These lines of evidence suggest that social structures became more differentiated over time in some regions, though variation remained substantial. Social complexity did not develop uniformly across the region and should not be understood as a single trajectory. Early prehistoric societies are generally interpreted as relatively small-scale and egalitarian. Settlement evidence indicates that groups were composed of limited numbers of individuals, likely organized around kin relationships. Decision-making structures are not directly observable, but the absence of marked differences in housing or material wealth suggests limited social stratification. Archaeologists emphasize that egalitarian organization does not imply lack of structure, but rather the absence of permanent hierarchies visible in the material record. As populations increased in some areas, particularly in resource-rich coastal and riverine environments, evidence points to more complex forms of social organization. Larger and more stable settlements required coordination of labor, resource scheduling, and access to territory. Repeated occupation of the same sites over long periods suggests established group claims to specific locations. These claims may have been maintained through social norms rather than formal enforcement, though direct evidence is limited. Burial practices provide one of the clearest archaeological indicators of social differentiation. In some regions and periods, burials vary in location, construction, and associated objects. While many burials are simple and lack grave goods, others include items such as shell beads, tools, or ornaments. Archaeologists debate whether these differences reflect social rank, age, role, or lineage. The presence of variation alone indicates that individuals were not treated identically in death, suggesting some degree of social differentiation. Shell beads are particularly important in discussions of social complexity. These objects required significant labor to produce and often appear in standardized forms. Their widespread distribution and consistent manufacture suggest shared conventions. In some contexts, shell beads are found in quantities that exceed what would be expected for personal adornment. Researchers suggest that they may have functioned as a medium of exchange or a measure of value, though the extent and formalization of such systems remain debated. The production of shell beads appears to have been concentrated in certain coastal areas with access to suitable shell species. From these areas, beads were distributed inland through exchange networks. Control over bead production and distribution may have conferred social influence to certain individuals or groups. Archaeologists caution, however, that evidence for centralized control is indirect. The archaeological record does not clearly demonstrate monopolies or coercive authority. Evidence for leadership structures is similarly indirect. In some later prehistoric sites, differences in house size, storage capacity, or burial treatment suggest the presence of individuals with greater access to resources. These differences are often subtle and unevenly expressed. Archaeologists generally avoid using terms such as chiefdom unless supported by multiple lines of evidence. In California, social complexity appears to have developed incrementally rather than through abrupt institutional change. Conflict and cooperation both played roles in shaping social organization. Evidence for interpersonal violence is present in some skeletal assemblages, including trauma consistent with weapon injuries. Defensive site locations, such as settlements on elevated or restricted terrain, have also been noted in certain regions. However, these features are not widespread and do not indicate constant warfare. Archaeologists interpret conflict as episodic and localized rather than pervasive. At the same time, cooperation is implied by large-scale construction and maintenance of features such as extensive midden deposits, bedrock mortars, and communal processing areas. These features would have required coordinated effort over long periods. Shared use of such facilities suggests social mechanisms for organizing labor and access. The specific forms of cooperation remain unknown, but the material evidence indicates repeated collective activity. Territoriality is another aspect of social complexity inferred from the archaeological record. As populations grew and resource use intensified, competition for productive areas likely increased. Evidence for territorial boundaries is indirect and includes clustering of sites, consistency in material culture within regions, and restricted access to certain resources. Exchange networks indicate that boundaries were permeable rather than rigid, allowing for interaction alongside competition. The role of trade and exchange in social organization extends beyond material movement. Participation in exchange networks required trust, shared norms, and mechanisms for resolving disputes. The persistence of these networks over long periods suggests stable social relationships between groups. Archaeologists argue that such relationships may have contributed to social integration at regional scales, even in the absence of centralized political structures. Storage practices also have implications for social complexity. The ability to store food reduces risk and allows accumulation of surplus. In some contexts, surplus may have been shared within groups or used to support social obligations. Archaeologists debate whether storage led directly to inequality or whether it functioned primarily as a communal buffer against environmental variability. Evidence supports multiple interpretations depending on region and period. Household organization is difficult to reconstruct due to limited preservation of domestic structures. Where evidence exists, such as post holes or living surfaces, it suggests variability in dwelling size and layout. Differences may reflect household composition, function, or duration of occupation rather than social rank. Archaeologists are cautious in linking architectural variation directly to hierarchy without supporting evidence. Ritual behavior and belief systems are largely inaccessible archaeologically. While some objects and contexts have been interpreted as having symbolic significance, such interpretations remain speculative. The focus of archaeological analysis is therefore on observable patterns rather than inferred meanings. Social complexity is assessed through material organization rather than assumed ideological structures. Regional variation in social complexity is evident. Coastal areas with dense populations and reliable resources tend to show stronger evidence for differentiation, exchange, and long-term settlement. Interior and desert regions generally show fewer indicators of formal social differentiation, consistent with lower population densities and higher mobility. These differences suggest that social organization was closely tied to ecological context. Archaeologists emphasize that social complexity should not be understood as a linear progression toward hierarchy. In California, evidence points to multiple forms of organization existing simultaneously. Some groups developed more differentiated structures, while others maintained relatively egalitarian arrangements. These forms could change over time in response to environmental, demographic, and social factors. Overall, the archaeological record indicates that social complexity among prehistoric humans in California increased in certain regions and periods, but remained variable and context-dependent. Differences in burial practices, exchange systems, settlement organization, and resource control suggest emerging social differentiation. At the same time, the absence of clear evidence for centralized authority or rigid class systems underscores the limits of complexity in many contexts. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as the outcome of long-term adaptation to diverse environments rather than as the result of uniform social evolution.